Outside the main door of the institute, Viktor met Shishakov getting out of his car. Shishakov raised his hat and said hello. He clearly didn't want to talk. That's bad, thought Viktor. At lunch, Professor Svechin was sitting at the next table, but he looked straight past Viktor without saying a word. Stout Dr. Gurevich talked to Viktor with particular warmth on his way out of the canteen. He pressed his hand for a long time, but as the door of the director's reception room opened, he quickly said goodbye and walked off down the corridor. In the laboratory, Markov, who was talking to Viktor about setting up the equipment for photographing atomic particles, suddenly looked up from his notes and said, "Viktor Pavlovich, I've heard that you are the subject of a very harsh discussion during a meeting of the party bureau. Kovchenko really had it in for you. He said Strum doesn't want to be a part of our collective." "Well," said Viktor, "that's that." He felt one of his eyelids beginning to twitch. While they were discussing the photographs, Viktor got the feeling that it was now Markov who was in charge of the laboratory. He had the calm voice of someone who is in control. Nozdrin twice came up to him to ask questions about the equipment. Then Markov's face took on a look of pathetic entreaty. "Viktor Pavlovich, if you say anything about this party meeting, please don't mention my name. I'll be accused of revealing party secrets." "Of course not. It's just a storm in a teacup." "Oh, I don't know," said Viktor. "You'll get by without me, and the ambiguities surrounding the operation of Psi are quite impossible." "I think you're wrong," said Markov. "I was talking to Kochkurov yesterday. You know what he's like. He's certainly got his feet on the ground. Well, he said, 'I know Strum's mathematics have overtaken his physics, but somehow I find his work very illuminating. I don't know why.'" Viktor understood what Markov was saying. Young Kochkurov was particularly interested in the action of slow neutrons on the nuclei of heavy atoms. In his view, work in this area had great practical possibilities. "It's not the Kochkurovs of this world who decide things," said Viktor. "The people who matter are the Badins, and he wants me to repent of leading physicists into Talmudic abstraction." Everyone in the laboratory seemed to know about yesterday's meeting and Viktor's conflict with the authorities. Anna Stepanovna kept giving Viktor sympathetic looks. Viktor wanted to talk to Sokolov, but he had gone to the academy in the morning and then rung up to say that he had been delayed and probably wouldn't return that day. Sevastyanov, for some reason, was in an excellent mood. "Viktor Pavlovich," he said, "you have before you the esteemed Gurevich, a brilliant and outstanding scientist." He put his hands on his head and stomach to denote Gurevich's bald head and pot belly. On his way home in the evening, Viktor suddenly met Maria Ivanovna on Kaluga Street. She saw him first and called out his name. She was wearing a coat he hadn't seen before, and he took a moment to recognize her. "How extraordinary," he said. "What's brought you to Kaluga Street?" For a moment she just looked at him in silence, and then she shook her head and said, "It's not a coincidence. I wanted to see you, that's all." Viktor didn't know what to say. For a moment his heart seemed to stop beating. He thought he was going to say something terrible, to warn him of danger. "Viktor Pavlovich, I just wanted a word with you. Pyotr Lavantreevich has told me what happened." "You mean my latest success?" said Viktor. They were walking side by side, but in silence, almost as though they didn't know one another. Viktor again felt embarrassed. He looked at Maria Ivanovna out of the corner of one eye and said, "Ludmila's very angry with me. I suppose you feel the same." "Not at all," she said. "I know what compelled you to act in that way." Viktor gave her a quick look. "You were thinking of your mother." He nodded. "Pyotr Lavantreevich didn't want to tell you. He's heard that the party organization and the institute authorities have really got it in for you. Apparently Badin said, it's not just a case of hysteria, it's political hysteria, anti-Soviet hysteria." "Oh, so that's what's the matter with me," said Viktor. Yes, I thought that Pyotr Lavandrovich was keeping something back. Yes, that upset me very much. Is he afraid? Yes, and he considers you to be in the wrong. Pyotr Lavandrovich is a good man. He's suffered a lot, said Victor. And that's what's upsetting. Such an audacious, brilliant scientist, and such a cowardly soul. He suffered a lot, said Maria Ivanovna. All the same, he should have told me. He took her arm. Listen, Maria Ivanovna, what's all this about Madyarov? I just don't understand. He was haunted by the thought of their conversations in Kazan. He kept remembering odd words, odd phrases, Karimov's alarming warning, and Madyarov's own suspicions. He was afraid that his blatherings in Kazan would soon be added to what was already brewing in Moscow. I don't understand myself, she replied. The registered letter we sent Leonid Sergeyevich was returned to us. Has he changed his address? Has he left Kazan? Has the worst happened? Yes, muttered Victor. For a moment he felt quite lost. Maria Ivanovna obviously thought that her husband had told Victor about the letter that had been returned, but Sokolov hadn't said a word. When Victor had asked that question, he had been thinking of the quarrel between Madyarov and Pyotr Lavandrovich. Let's go into the park, he said. We're going in the wrong direction. There's a way in off Kaluga Street. He wanted to know more about Madyarov and to tell her of his and Karimov's suspicions of one another. The park would be empty. No one would disturb them there. Maria Ivanovna would understand the import of such a conversation. He'd be able to talk freely and openly about everything that troubled him, and she would be equally frank. A thaw had set in. On the slopes you could see damp, rotting leaves peeping out from under the melting snow. In the gullies, however, the snow was still quite thick. The sky above was cloudy and sombre. What a beautiful evening, said Victor, breathing in the cool, damp air. Yes, and there isn't a soul around. It's like being in the country. They walked down the muddy paths. When they came to a puddle, he held out his hand and helped her across. For a long time they didn't say a word. Victor didn't want to talk about the war, the institute, Madyarov, or any of his fears and premonitions. All he wanted was to keep on walking, without saying a word, beside this small woman with the light yet awkward step, and to prolong this feeling of lightness and peace that had suddenly come over him. Maria Ivanovna didn't say a word. She just walked on beside him, her head slightly bowed. They came out onto the quay. The river was covered with a layer of dark ice. I like this, said Victor. Yes, she agreed, it's good. The asphalt path along the quay was quite dry, and they walked more quickly, like travellers on a long journey. A wounded lieutenant and a stocky young girl in a ski suit were coming towards them. They had their arms round one another and were stopping every now and then to kiss. As they passed Victor and Maria Ivanovna, they kissed again, looked round, and burst out laughing. Who knows, thought Victor. Perhaps Nadia came for a walk here with her lieutenant. Maria Ivanovna looked round at the young couple and said, How sad it all is. She smiled. Ludmila Nikolaevna told me all about Nadia. Yes, said Victor. It's all very strange. And then he added, I've decided to phone the director of the Electromechanical Institute and offer my services. If they don't accept me, I'll have to go somewhere like Novosibirsk or Krasnoyarsk. Yes, that's the best thing you can do, she said. What can I say? You couldn't have acted any other way. How sad it all is. He wanted to say what a deep love he felt now for his work and his laboratory. He wanted to say that when he looked at the new apparatus, now almost complete, he felt a strange blend of joy and sorrow, that he sometimes felt he would come back to the institute at night and peer through the windows. But he didn't say anything. He was afraid Maria Ivanovna would think he was putting on an act. As they came to the exhibition of war trophies, they slowed down to look at an aeroplane with black swastikas and at the grey German tanks, field guns and mortars. They look terrifying enough even like this, said Maria Ivanovna. They're not so bad, said Victor. By the time the next war comes, they'll seem as innocent as muskets and halberds. They reached the gate. "So our walk's come to an end," said Victor. "What a pity this park's so small. You're not tired?" "I'm not at all. I do a lot of walking." Either she was pretending not to understand, or she really didn't. "It's strange," she said. "Our meetings always seem to depend on your meetings with Lyudmila, or mine with Pyotr Lavantreevich." "Yes," she agreed, "but how else could it be?" They left the park. The noise of the city surrounded them again, destroying the charm of their quiet walk. They came out onto a square not far from where they had first met. Looking up at him, as though she were a little girl and he were an adult, she said, "Just now you probably feel a special love for your work, for your laboratory and equipment. But you couldn't have acted in any other way. Another man could, but not you. I've brought you bad news, but I always think it's best to know the truth." "Thank you, Maria Ivanovna," said Victor, squeezing her hand. "And not only for that." He thought he could feel her fingers trembling in his hand. "How strange," she said. "We're saying goodbye almost exactly where we met." Victor smiled. "It's not for nothing that the ancient said, 'In my beginning is my end.'" Maria Ivanovna frowned as she puzzled over this, and then she laughed and said, "I don't understand." Victor watched as she walked down the street, a short, skinny woman, not someone a passerby would turn round to look at. Derensky had seldom been so bored or depressed as during these weeks in the Kalmyk steppe. He had sent a telegram to front headquarters saying that he had completed his mission, that his continued presence on the extreme left flank, where there was in any case no activity, served no purpose. With an obstinacy he found incomprehensible, his superiors had still not recalled him. It wasn't so bad when he was working. What was most difficult was when he was off duty. There was sand everywhere, dry, rustling, slippery sand. Of course, even this supported life. You could hear the rustle of lizards and tortoises and see the tracks left by the lizards' tails. Here and there you came across thorn bushes, themselves the colour of sand. Kites hovered in the air, searching for refuse or carrion. Spiders ran past on long legs. The stern poverty, the cold monotony of the snowless November desert seemed to have devastated the men who had been posted here. Their way of life, even their thoughts, seemed to have become equally dreary. Little by little, Derensky had submitted to this monotony. He had always been indifferent to food, but now he thought of little else. The endless meals of sour-tasting soup made from pearl barley and marinated tomatoes, followed by pearl barley porridge, had become a nightmare. Sometimes he found it unbearable to sit in the gloom of the small barn, in front of puddles of soup splashed over a table knocked together from a few planks, watching everyone sipping their soup from flat tin bowls. All he wanted was to get out, to escape the rattle of spoons and the nauseating smell. But as soon as he left, he began to count the hours till the next day's meal. The huts were cold at night. Derensky slept badly. His back froze, his ears and legs froze, his fingers froze, his cheeks froze. He went to bed without undressing, with 2 pairs of footcloths round his feet and a towel round his head. At first he had been amazed at the way people he met seemed almost to have forgotten the war. They seemed to have no room in their minds for anything except food, tobacco, and clean laundry. But soon he noticed himself thinking of all kinds of trivia, all kinds of petty hopes and disappointments, as he talked to the commanders of divisions and batteries about axle grease, ammunition supplies, and how best to prepare the guns for the winter. Front headquarters now seemed impossibly distant. His dream was to spend a day at army headquarters near Elista, but it wasn't Alla Sergeyevna and her blue eyes that he dreamed of. He dreamed of a bath, clean underwear, and soup with white noodles. Even the night he'd spent at Bova's now seemed pleasant and agreeable. It hadn't been such a bad hut after all, and they hadn't talked only about soup and clean laundry. The worst torment of all was the lice. It had taken him some time to realize why he was always itching. He had failed to understand people's knowing smiles when he had furiously begun scratching his thigh or armpit in the middle of a serious discussion. Every day he had scratched with increasing zeal. He had felt a constant burning under his armpits. He had thought he had had eczema, that the dust and sand must be irritating his dry skin. Sometimes on his way somewhere he'd stop and suddenly begin scratching his legs, his stomach, the small of his back. It was worst of all at night. He'd wake up and scratch furiously at his chest. Once when he was lying on his back, he had stuck his legs up in the air and moaned as he scratched at his thighs. His eczema seemed to be aggravated by heat. Under the blankets it became unbearable. If he went out in the frost it calmed down. He decided to go to the first aid post and ask for some ointment. One morning he had turned down his shirt collar and seen a row of sleepy, full-grown lice along the seam. There were dozens of them. He had looked round in embarrassment at the captain, who slept in the next bed. He was sitting there with a ferocious expression on his face. He had spread out his pants and was squashing the lice that infested them. He was moving his lips silently, evidently keeping a tally. Derensky took off his shirt and began doing the same. It was a quiet, misty morning. There was no shooting, and no planes going by overhead. You could hear distinct cracks as the lice perished, one after another, beneath the fingernails of the two officers. The captain glanced at Derensky and muttered, "There's a fine one for you. A real bear of a louse, a breeding sow." His eyes still on his shirt collar, Derensky said, "Don't they issue any powder?" "They do," said the captain, "but it's a waste of time. What we need is a good wash. There isn't even enough water to drink. They can't even wash the plates properly in the canteen. There's certainly no chance of a bath." "What about the ovens?" "Well, that's no use either. The uniforms come back scorched, and the lice just get a suntan. And when I think of the time we were quartered in Penza, I never even went to the canteen. The landlady fed me herself. She was a nice, plump woman, not too old. We had baths twice a week, beer every day." "Oh, I know," said Derensky. "But what's to be done? It's a long way to Penza." The captain looked at him seriously and said, as if revealing a secret, "There is one good method, comrade lieutenant colonel. Snuff. You grind up a brick, mix it with snuff, and sprinkle it on your underwear. The lice begin sneezing, and that makes them jump, and then they bash their heads in against the brick." The captain kept such a straight face that it took Derensky some time to realize this was a joke. During the next few days he heard at least a dozen stories in a similar vein. The folklore of lice was evidently a rich field of study. Day and night his mind was occupied with a host of questions. Food, a change of underwear, clean uniform, louse powder, extermination of lice by ironing them with a heated bottle, by freezing them to death, by burning them to death. He no longer thought of women at all. He remembered a saying the criminals had used in the camps: "You may live, but you won't love." Derensky had spent all day inspecting the guns of the artillery division. He hadn't seen a single plane or heard a single shot. The division's commander, a young Kazakh, said very clearly and without a trace of an accent, "You know what? Next year I'm going to grow some melons. You must come back and try one." The divisional commander was at home in the desert. He cracked jokes, bared his white teeth in a smile, and moved with quick and effortless steps through the deep sand. He even glanced amiably at the camels standing in harness by the huts with their corrugated iron roofs. Derensky found his cheerfulness irritating. In search of solitude, he decided to return to the emplacements of the first battery, though he had already been there during the day. An enormous moon had risen. It seemed more black than red, glowing crimson with effort. It climbed up into the transparent black of the sky. The mortars, anti-tank weapons, and the barrels of the guns looked strangely threatening in this angry light. Along the road stretched a caravan of camels. They were harnessed to squeaking village carts loaded with hay and boxes of shells. It was an unlikely scene. Tractors, the lorry with the printing press for the Army Journal, a thin radio mast, the long necks of the camels, and their undulating walk that made it seem as though their whole body was made out of rubber, without a single hard bone. The camels passed by, leaving a smell of hay in the frosty air. The same huge moon, more black than red, had shone over the deserted fields where Prince Igor was to give battle. The same moon had shone when the Persian hosts marched into Greece, when the Roman legions invaded the German forests, when the battalions of the first consul had watched night fall over the pyramids. Derensky, his head sunk into his shoulders, was sitting on a box of shells and listening to two soldiers who lay stretched out under their greatcoats beside the guns. The battery commander and his political instructor had gone to divisional HQ. The lieutenant colonel from front HQ, the soldiers had found out who he was from a signaller, seemed to be fast asleep. The soldiers puffed blissfully at the cigarettes they'd rolled, letting out clouds of smoke. They were obviously close friends. You could tell from their certainty that whatever happened to one was of equal interest to the other. "So, what happened?" said one of them, feigning mockery and indifference. "You know the bastard as well as I do," said the second soldier with pretended reluctance. "How can he expect a man to walk in boots like these?" "So, what happened?" "So, here I am in the same old boots. I'm not going to walk barefoot, am I?" "So he wouldn't give you new boots?" said the second gunner. His voice was now full of interest. Every trace of mockery and indifference had disappeared. Their talk turned to their homes. "What do you expect a woman to write about? This is out of stock, and that's out of stock. If the boy isn't ill, then it's the girl. You know what women are like." "Oh, mine's quite straightforward about it. She says, 'You lot at the front are all right. You've got your rations. As for us, we really are having a hard time.'" "That's woman's logic for you," said the first gunner. "There she is, sitting in the rear, and she hasn't got a clue what it's like at the front. All she knows about are your rations." "That's right. She can't get hold of any kerosene. She thinks it's the end of the world." "Sure, it's 1,000 times more difficult to wait in a queue than to sit here in the desert and fight off enemy tanks with empty bottles." They were both well aware that there had been no tank attacks anywhere near them. Interrupting the eternal discussion, who was the hardest role in life, man or woman, one of them said hesitantly, "Oh, mine's fallen ill, though. She's got something wrong with her back. She only has to lift something heavy and she's in bed for a week." Once again the conversation seemed to take a different direction. They began to talk about the accursed waterless desert around them. The second gunner, the one lying closest to Derensky, said, "She didn't write that to upset me. She just doesn't understand." Wanting to take back, but not completely take back, his harsh words about soldiers' wives, the first gunner said, "I know, I was just being stupid." They smoked for a while in silence, then started discussing the respective merits of safety razors and cutthroats, the battery commander's new jacket, and how you still want to go on living no matter how hard things may be. "Just look at the night. You know, I once saw a picture like this when I went to school. The full moon over a field and dead warriors lying on the ground." "It doesn't sound much like us," said the other with a laugh. "We're not warriors. We're more like sparrows." The silence was suddenly broken by an explosion to Derensky's right. 103 millimeters, he said to himself at once. All the usual thoughts immediately went through his mind. Was that a stray shot? Are they registering? I hope they haven't already bracketed us. Is it going to be a full-scale barrage? Are they preparing the ground for a tank attack? Every experienced soldier was asking the same questions. An experienced soldier can distinguish one genuinely alarming sound from among 100 others. Whatever he's doing, eating, cleaning his rifle, writing a letter, scratching his nose, reading a newspaper, even if his mind is as empty as only that of an off-duty soldier can be, he cocks his head and listens intently and avidly. The answer came straight away. There were explosions to the right of them, then to the left of them, and suddenly everything began shaking, smoking and thundering. A full-scale barrage. The flames of the explosions pierced the clouds of smoke, dust and sand. At the same time, smoke poured out of the flames. Everywhere people were running for cover, dropping to the ground. The desert was filled by a terrible howl. Mortar bombs had begun falling near the camels. They were running wild, upsetting their carts and dragging their broken harnesses along the ground. Derensky just stood there, forgetting the whistling shells, gazing in horror at the appalling spectacle. He couldn't rid himself of the thought that these were the last days of his motherland. He felt a sense of doom. The terrible howl of maddened camels, the anxious Russian voices, the men running for shelter. Russia was dying. Here she was, driven into the cold sands of Asia, dying under a sullen, indifferent moon. The Russian language he so cherished had become mingled with the terrified screams of wounded camels. What he felt at this bitter moment was not anger or hatred, but a feeling of brotherhood towards everything poor and weak. For some reason, he glimpsed the dark face of the old kalmyk he had met in the steppe. He seemed very close, as though they'd known one another for a long time. We're in the hands of fate, he thought, realizing that he had rather not stay alive if Russia was defeated. He looked round at the soldiers. They were lying prone in whatever hollows they had been able to find. He drew himself up to his full height, ready to take command of the battery, and called out, "Where's the telephonist? Quick, I want you right here." At that very moment, the thunder of explosions ceased. That night, on Stalin's orders, the commanders of 3 fronts, Vatutin, Rokossovsky and Yeremenko, launched the offensive that, within 100 hours, was to decide the Battle of Stalingrad and the fate of Paulus's 330,000-strong army, the offensive that was to mark a turning point in the war. A telegram was waiting for Kerensky at headquarters. He was to attach himself to Colonel Novikov's tank corps and keep the General Staff informed of its operations. Soon after the anniversary of the revolution, there had been another massive air raid on the central power station. 18 bombers took part. Clouds of smoke covered the ruins. The power station had finally been brought to a standstill. After the raid, Spiridonov's hands had begun to tremble convulsively. He splashed tea everywhere if he tried to lift a mug to his lips. Sometimes he had to put it straight back on the table, knowing he couldn't hold it any longer. His hands only stopped trembling when he drank vodka. He and Kamishov began allowing the workers to leave. They crossed the Volga and made their way through the steppe to Akhtuba and Leninsk. At the same time, they themselves asked Moscow for permission to leave. There was little sense in their remaining in the front line among these ruins. Moscow was slow to reply, and Spiridonov became increasingly nervous. Nikolaev, the party organizer, had already been summoned by the Central Committee. He had left for Moscow in a Douglas. Spiridonov and Kamishov spent their time wandering through the ruins, telling one another there was nothing left for them to do, and they'd better get the hell out of there. But Moscow still didn't reply. Spiridonov was particularly worried about Vera. She had begun to feel ill after crossing to the left bank and had been unable to make the journey to Leninsk. She was in the last stages of pregnancy, and there was no question of her travelling nearly 100 kilometres in the back of a truck along frozen, potholed roads. Some workers she knew took her to a barge that had been converted into a hostel. It was moored close to the bank, fast in the ice. Soon after the bombing of the power station, Vera had sent her father a note by a mechanic on one of the launches. She told him that he wasn't to worry and that she had been given a comfortable little corner in the hold behind a partition. Among the other evacuees on the barge was a nurse from the Beketovka clinic and an old midwife. If there were any complications, they could call a doctor from the field hospital 4 kilometres away. They had hot water on the barge and a stove. The obcom supplied them with food, and they all ate together. Although she told him not to worry, every word of her note filled Spiridonov with anxiety. The only crumb of comfort was that as yet the barge hadn't been bombed. If he could only get across to the left bank himself, he could get hold of a car or ambulance and take her at least as far as Akhtuba. But there was no word from Moscow. They still hadn't authorized the departure of the director and chief engineer, though there was no longer any need for anyone at the power station except a small armed guard. The workers and engineers had no wish to hang around there with nothing to do. They had all crossed to the left bank as soon as Spiridonov gave his permission. Only old Andreyev refused to accept the official permit bearing the director's round stamp. When Spiridonov suggested he join his daughter-in-law and grandson in Leninsk, he just said, "No, I'm staying here." He felt that as long as he stayed on the Stalingrad bank, he still had some link with his former life. Maybe in a little while he'd be able to get to the tractor factory. He'd make his way through the houses that had been burnt down or blown apart and come to the garden laid out by his wife. He'd straighten the young, injured trees, check whether the things they'd buried were still in their hiding place, and sit down on a stone by the broken fence. Well, Varvara, the sewing machine's still in its place, and it hasn't even got rusty. But I'm afraid the apple tree by the fence has had its day. It must have been caught by a splinter. As for the sauerkraut in the cellar, that's fine, it's just got a tiny bit of mould on top. Spiridonov very much wanted to talk things over with Krimov, but Krimov hadn't once looked in since the anniversary of the revolution. Spiridonov and Kamishov agreed to wait until 17th of November and then leave. There really was nothing whatever for them to do. The Germans were still shelling the power station now and again, and Kamishov, who'd lost his nerve after the last air raid, said, "Oh, Stepan Fyodorovich, if they're still shelling us, then their intelligence service is a dead loss. They may bomb us again any moment. You know the Germans, they're like bulls, they just carry on pounding away." On 18th of November, without waiting for permission from Moscow, Spiridonov said goodbye to the guard, embraced Andreev, looked for a last time at the ruins, and left. He had worked hard and honourably. His achievement was all the more worthy of respect in that he was afraid of war, was unaccustomed to conditions at the front, had lived in constant fear of air raids, and gone completely to pieces during the bombardments themselves. He had a suitcase in one hand and a bundle over his shoulder. He waved to Andreev, who was standing by the ruined gates, then looked round at the engineer's building with its broken windows, at the gloomy walls of the turbine workshop, and at the smoke from the still burning insulators. He left the power station when there was nothing more that he could do there, only 24 hours before the beginning of the Soviet offensive. But in the eyes of many people, those 24 hours outweighed all he had done before. Ready to greet him as a hero, they branded him a coward and a deserter. Long afterwards he was to be tormented by the memory of how he had turned round and waved, of how he had seen a solitary old man standing by the gate, watching him. Vera gave birth to a son. She lay in the hold on a plank bed. The other women had thrown a heap of rags on top so she wouldn't be quite so cold. Beside her, wrapped in a sheet, lay her baby. When someone came in and parted the curtains, she saw the other men and women and the rags hanging down from the upper bunks. She heard the cries of children, the continual commotion and the buzz of voices. She felt as though her head was as full of fog and confusion as the fetid air. The hold was both stuffy and extremely cold. Here and there you could see patches of frost on the plank walls. People slept in their felt boots and padded jackets. All day long the women sat huddled up in shawls and strips of blanket, blowing on their freezing fingers. The tiny window, almost on a level with the ice, hardly let in any light. It was dark, even in the daytime. At night they lit oil lamps, but the glass covers were missing, and their faces were covered in soot. Clouds of steam came in when they opened the trap door from the bridge. It was like a shell burst. Old women combed their long grey hair. Old men sat on the floor holding mugs of hot water to warm their hands. Children wrapped up in shawls crawled about among the jumble of pillows, bundles, and plywood suitcases. Vera felt that her body, her thoughts, and her attitude towards other people had all been changed by the baby at her breast. She thought about her friend Zina Melnikova, about Sergeyevna, the old woman who looked after her here, about spring, about her mother, about the hole in her shirt, about the quilted blanket, about Seriotsa and Tolya, about washing powder, about German planes, about the bunker at the power station and her own unwashed hair. All these thoughts were somehow infused with her feelings for her baby. It was only in relation to him that they had meaning. She looked at her hands, her legs, her breasts, her fingers. They were no longer the same hands that had played volleyball, written essays, and turned the pages of books. They were no longer the same legs that had run up the school steps, that had been stung by nettles, that had kicked against the warm water of the river, that passers-by had turned to stare at. When she thought about her son, she thought simultaneously about Viktorov. There were airfields not far away. He was probably very close. The Volga no longer separated them. Any moment some pilots might come into the hold. "Do you know Lieutenant Viktorov?" "Yes, we certainly do." "Tell him that his son's here, and his wife." The other women came to visit her in her little corner. They shook their heads, smiled, and sighed. Some of them cried as they bent over the baby. It was themselves they were crying over, and the baby they were smiling at. This went without saying. The questions people asked Vera all centered around one thing. How could she best serve her child? Did she have enough milk? Was she getting mastitis? Was she suffering from damp? Her father appeared 2 days after the baby's birth. Unshaven, his nose and cheeks burnt by the icy wind, his collar turned up, his coat fastened at the waist by a tie, carrying a small suitcase and a bundle. No one would have taken him for the director of the central power station. She noticed that when he came up to her bunk, his trembling face turned first of all to the creature beside her. Then he turned away. She could tell from his back and shoulders that he was crying. She realized that he was crying because his wife would never know about their grandson, would never bend over him as he himself had just done. Only then, angry and ashamed that dozens of people had seen him crying, did he say in a hoarse voice, "So, you've made me a grandfather." He bent down, kissed her on the forehead, and patted her shoulder with a cold, dirty hand. Then he said, "Grimov came round on the anniversary of the revolution. He didn't know your mother had died, and he kept asking about Xenia." An old man, wearing a torn jacket that was losing its padding, came up and wheezed, "Comrade Spiridonov, people are awarded the Order of Kutuzov, the Order of Lenin, the Red Star, are all for killing as many men as they can. Just think how many men have died on both sides. Well, I think your daughter deserves a medal that weighs a good 2 kilos for giving birth to new life in a hellhole like this." It was the first time since the baby's birth that anyone had said anything about Vera herself. Spiridonov decided to stay on the barge till Vera was stronger. Then they could go to Leninsk together. It was on the way to Kubyshev. He'd have to go there for a new appointment. The food on the barge was obviously quite appalling. Once he had warmed up a bit, he set off into the forest to find the command post of the obcom. He knew it was somewhere nearby. He hoped he'd be able to get hold of some fat and some sugar through his friends there.